Aderin hadn't planned on setting foot inside the ballroom tonight. She was supposed to be 3 floors below in the sewing chamber, reattaching the beaded overlay on Lady Moriath's gown after the clasp had snapped during rehearsal. Simple work, quiet work, the sort of work that didn't involve 500 nobles, a full orchestra, and the most dangerous alpha in the known world sitting on a gilded throne 40 feet away. But Lady Moriarty's younger sister had torn her bodice mid-waltz, and since no one else in the palace could restitch Valtteri silk without leaving visible thread lines, Aderin had been hauled upstairs with a needle between her teeth and a pincushion strapped to her wrist. She'd fixed the tear in under 4 minutes, tucked into an alcove behind a marble column where no one important could see her. She was already backing toward the service corridor, already tasting freedom, when a hand caught her elbow. "Dance with me," Aderin turned. The man was tall, broad, golden-haired, and smiling down at her with an easy confidence that came from never once in his life being told no. She recognized him immediately. Lord Halwyn, Alpha of the Greycrest Pack, third in line for the Northern Territories, and very clearly, 3 glasses past good judgment. "My lord, I'm not a guest," Aderin stammered, pulling at her elbow. "I'm the seamstress." "Even better," Lord Halwyn said, already drawing her forward with the inexorable gravity of a man used to getting what he wanted. "You won't step on my feet out of political obligation." Before she could mount a second protest, they were on the dance floor. His hand settled on her waist. His palm was warm and heavy through the thin fabric of her work dress, and Aderin's face burned crimson because every person in the room could see that she did not belong here. Her dress was plain, gray linen. Her hair was pinned up with a bone needle instead of jeweled combs. She had thread dust on her sleeves, and a thimble still jammed on her left index finger. Lord Halwyn didn't seem to notice or care. He guided her through the steps, with practiced, wine-loosened ease, chatting amiably about something she couldn't hear over the roar of her own pulse. She stared at his collar and tried to survive the next 3 minutes without dying of embarrassment. That was when the air changed. It started as a pressure, subtle at first, like the drop before a thunderstorm. The hairs on the back of Aderin's neck rose. A prickling awareness crawled across her skin, sharp and electric, and deep inside her. Something stirred, something that had never stirred before in her entire life. Lord Halwyn's smile faltered. His hand tightened on her waist, and his gaze lifted over her shoulder, toward the far end of the room. His face went pale. The music stumbled. One violin scraped to a halt, then another. The waltz collapsed, instrument by instrument, until only the cellist remained, dragging out a single trembling note before that too fell silent. Aderin turned. King Tavern Morkent was on his feet. He had been seated on the raised dais all evening, still as carved stone, his expression betraying nothing. The rumors said he hadn't spoken more than a dozen words all night. The rumors also said he was dying, though no one dared say it above a whisper. He had the look of a man being worn away from the inside, a king whose throne was slowly becoming too large for the body sitting in it. He was not seated now. He was moving, walking down the steps of the dais, with a slow, measured, predatory purpose that made the crowd part before him, like water around a blade. His dark eyes were fixed on her, on them. Gold bled through the dark of his irises, a shimmer that caught the candlelight and turned his gaze molten. Wolf eyes. Aderin had seen Alphas shift before, had seen the telltale flash of gold that preceded the change. But the court had been whispering for months that King Tavern's wolf was gone, that it hadn't surfaced since the Ashfall campaign over a year ago. That the Alpha King of Eldrinmere could no longer shift, and that his body was failing. Because of it, his wolf was surfacing now. Lord Halwyn's hand dropped from her waist, like she'd scorched him. He stepped back, then stepped back again, putting distance between himself and Aderin, with the urgency of a man who understood exactly what a territorial alpha looked like, seconds before violence. Tavern crossed, the remaining distance in 4 strides. He stopped less than an arm's length from Aderin, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his body, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his jaw, and the way his hands had balled tight at his sides. The gold in his eyes pulsed bright, then dim, then bright again, like a flame fighting to stay lit. The entire ballroom held its breath. 500 people, frozen mid-step, mid-sip, mid-sentence. Aderin couldn't move. She couldn't think. Every instinct she possessed was screaming 2 contradictory things at once. Run. Stay. Something deep in her ribs had become a roar, a gravity that wanted to close the remaining distance between them and never let go. Tavern's nostrils flared. He inhaled once, deep and shuddering, and the gold in his eyes blazed so bright, the nearest dancers flinched backward. Then it died. The gold receded, like a tide pulling back from shore. His expression, shuttered closed, and something that might have been horror flickered across his face before he buried it beneath iron control. Lord Halwyn, Tavern said, and his voice was raw, scraped hollow. You're needed in the Eastern Gallery now. Halwyn didn't argue. He bowed once, shallow and fast, and disappeared into the crowd like a man fleeing a burning building. Tavern looked at Aderin for one more breath. His gaze dropped to the thimble, still on her finger, to the dust on her sleeves, to the bone needle in her hair. Something shifted in his expression. Confusion, maybe, or something worse. Recognition. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't return to the dais. He left the ballroom entirely, and the heavy doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed through the silence like a crack of thunder. The music resumed, hesitant and uncertain. The crowd began to murmur. 500 whispered conversations, erupting at once, and Aderin stood alone on the dance floor, with her heart slamming against her ribs, a thimble on her finger, and absolutely no idea what had just happened. She made it to the service corridor before her legs gave out. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall and tried to breathe through the tightness in her throat. Her hands were shaking. The tug was still there, fainter now but persistent, pulling toward the direction the king had gone, like a thread stitched through her ribs. You? The voice came from her left. A man stepped out of the shadows, tall and lean, with close-cropped hair, and a face that gave away absolutely nothing. She recognized him too. Walder, the king's beta. His right hand, the man who ran the palace with quiet, terrifying efficiency. The man no one wanted to be summoned by. "What is your name?" Calder asked. "Aderin," she managed. "I'm a seamstress. I was only here to fix a torn dress. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, and I certainly didn't ask Lord Halwyn to dance. He just grabbed me." "What did you do to the king?" Calder asked, ignoring everything she'd said. "I didn't do anything," Aderin said, her voice climbing. "He just stood up and walked over, and I don't understand why." Calder studied her face for a long, uncomfortable moment. "His eyes," he said carefully. "Did you notice anything about his eyes?" Aderin swallowed hard. They were gold. Something passed across Calder's face. It was there and gone so fast she almost missed it. But it looked dangerously close to hope. "Go back to your quarters," he said. "Don't speak about what happened tonight. Not to anyone, not even Mistress Tessara." "Am I in trouble?" Aderin asked. "I don't know yet," Calder replied. He held her gaze for one more beat, then turned and strode down the corridor in the direction the king had disappeared, leaving Aderin alone, with her racing pulse and a growing certainty that something enormous had just shifted beneath her feet. She just had no idea what. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw gold. The summons came at dawn. A guard appeared at the door to the seamstress's quarters before the morning bell had even rung, his expression carefully neutral in the way that palace guards perfected when delivering news that could mean either a reward or a cell. "You're wanted in the East Wing," he said, "by the king's beta." Aderin's stomach plummeted. She dressed with fingers that wouldn't cooperate, fumbling with buttons she'd sewn herself and could normally fasten blind. She caught her reflection in the small tin mirror above the wash basin. She looked terrified. Wonderful. The walk to the east wing felt endless. Every corridor stretched longer than it should, every shadow pressed a little darker. She kept replaying the moment from the ball. The gold in his eyes, the way he'd crossed the room like something inside him had seized control. She found Calder in a small receiving room that smelled of cold stone and beeswax. He was standing by the window, with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the courtyard below. "Miss Otterin," he said without turning, "thank you for coming so promptly." "Did I have a choice?" she asked before she could stop herself. Calder's mouth twitched. Almost a smile, but not quite. "The king has a meeting this morning with the Border Council. Trade disputes. Nothing sensitive. It will last roughly 2 hours." He turned to face her. "I'd like you to be present." Aderin stared at him. "I'm a seamstress. I'm aware. Why would a seamstress be at a Border Council meeting?" Calder paused, choosing his words with visible care. "Think of it as a test," he said. "You'll sit against the wall in the back of the room. You won't speak. You won't draw attention to yourself. You'll simply be present, and I'll observe." "And the king?" Aderin asked, her pulse quickening. "Does he know I'll be there?" "No," Calder said. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "You're experimenting on your own king," Aderin said, without telling him. Something shifted in Calder's posture. Just slightly. Just enough for Aderin to see the bone-deep exhaustion beneath the composure. "The king hasn't shifted in 14 months, he said quietly. "Not once. His wolf has been completely silent since he returned from the Ashfall campaign. Every healer, every herbalist, every mystic we've brought in has tried to reach it. Nothing has worked. Not one thing in all that time." He held her gaze. "Last night, for the first time in over a year, his wolf surfaced, and the only thing that changed was you." Aderin felt the blood drain from her face. "That could have been anything. The crowd, the music, Lord Halwyn provoking him." "I considered all of those," Calder said, "which is exactly why I need to rule them out. 2 hours. Sit in a chair. That's all I'm asking." Aderin wanted to refuse. She wanted to go back to her sewing chamber, and her thread, and her quiet, invisible life where kings didn't look at her with burning gold eyes, and betas didn't speak to her like she might be the answer to something she couldn't possibly understand. But the way Calder had said it, the careful way he'd held the number, like it weighed more than he could carry alone, something about it made her throat ache in a way she couldn't explain. "Fine," she said. 2 hours. The council chamber was wide and bright, with tall arched windows that let in pale morning light. 12 men and women sat around a curved table, shuffling documents and speaking in low, practiced murmurs. At the head of the table, King Tavern Morcant sat with his gaze fixed on a sheaf of papers, a quill balanced in his hand, and an expression that suggested the trade disputes of Eldermere's northern border were the only things keeping him tethered to consciousness. Aderin lowered herself into the chair Calder had positioned against the far wall and pressed her hands together in her lap. She was as far from the king as the room would allow, easily 30 feet, separated by the entire length of the council table, and a dozen people between them. She tried to make herself invisible. It was a skill she'd spent her entire life perfecting. The meeting began. Trade tariffs on Greycrest iron, a fishing rights dispute along the northern channel, a proposed levy on imported timber, the grinding necessary governance that kept a kingdom running and made everyone's eyes glaze. Aderin watched the king. She couldn't seem to stop. He was thinner than she'd realized. The formal coat he'd worn at the ball had hidden the worst of it. But here, in his working clothes, she could see the way the fabric hung slightly loose at his shoulders. The shadows beneath his eyes were deep purple bruises, like he hadn't slept properly in months. His skin had the faintly gray cast of a man running on sheer will and nothing else. He looked like he was being erased, like someone was slowly rubbing him out from the inside, leaving less of him each day. Because they are, she thought, and the realization settled over her like ice water. A shifter without his wolf was a death sentence. Slow, but certain. 20 minutes passed. The discussion shifted to grain storage. A counselor with a reedy voice was outlining projected shortfalls for the winter stores when the king's quill paused mid-stroke. It was subtle. A hesitation so brief that no one at the table noticed. But Otterin saw it because she was watching his hands. His fingers tightened around the quill, then relaxed. His head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like a man hearing a distant sound he hadn't heard in a very long time and had given up hoping to hear again. His eyes flickered gold. Adderin's breath caught. It was barely there, a flash so quick she might have imagined it, but she hadn't imagined it, because Calder, standing motionless by the door, with his arms folded, had gone completely rigid. The king blinked. His jaw tightened. He forced his attention back to the papers with visible effort. But there it was. Again, 3 minutes later. The gold flickered through his dark irises, like light through deep water, and this time, his free hand moved to his sternum, pressing flat as if something beneath his ribs had stirred from a long, terrible sleep. The counselor kept talking. No one else noticed a thing, but Calder noticed, and Adderin noticed. And when the king's breathing deepened, and the gold pulsed, a third time, longer now, holding for 2 full seconds before fading, Calder turned his head, slowly, and met Adderin's eyes across the room. The look he gave her made the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was the look of a man who had been drowning for over a year and had just felt something solid beneath his feet. The meeting ended. The counselors filed out, still debating tariff percentages. The king gathered his papers with the methodical efficiency of a man who refused to acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred and left the chamber without looking at anyone. Calder waited until the room had emptied completely before crossing to Adderin's chair. 3 times, he said. I saw, Adderin whispered. 30 feet apart, Calder continued, his voice low and steady but his eyes betraying him. And his wolf surfaced 3 times in under 2 hours. It hasn't done that since the campaign. Not with any healer, any remedy, any intervention we've tried. What does that mean? Adderin asked, though she was afraid of the answer. It means I need you back here tomorrow, Calder said closer this time. A chill crawled down Adderin's spine. This wasn't going to stop. Whatever she'd accidentally started at the ball, whatever she was to the king's wolf, the beta wasn't going to let her walk away from it. And the worst part, the part that frightened her most, was that the tug in her own blood didn't want her to walk away either. Does the king know? She asked again. Calder hesitated for the first time since she'd met him. He felt his wolf stir during the meeting. He doesn't know why. He'll assume it was a fluke, a spasm of something already dying. His voice tightened on the word. I'd rather have proof before I give him hope. Proof that it's me, Adderin said. Proof that it's you, Calder confirmed. And not a coincidence. I'm too desperate to question. He left her alone in the empty council chamber with the morning light streaming through the tall windows and a growing, suffocating certainty that her quiet, invisible life had ended the moment the king's eyes turned gold. They moved her closer the next day, 15 feet instead of 30, a chair, positioned along the side wall of the king's private study, while he reviewed military dispatches with 2 of his generals. The wolf surfaced 5 times in 1 hour. Longer flashes, deeper gold. On the 3rd day, Calder moved her to 10 feet. A bench near the hearth, while the king read correspondence alone. She brought a basket of mending as cover. Something to do with her hands while she pretended not to notice that the most powerful man in the realm was being quietly, unknowingly studied. By his own beta. 7 flashes in 40 minutes. And on the 7th, a low growl rumbled through the king's throat like distant thunder. He pressed his hand flat against the desk, his knuckles going white, and looked up sharply. His gaze swept the room and stopped dead on Aderin. She froze with a needle halfway through a sleeve seam. For 3 full heartbeats, those gold-rimmed eyes held hers. Something moved behind them. Something vast and animal and achingly aware that recognized her in a way she could not explain and was not prepared for. The tug behind her breastbone seized tight, and her own heartbeat stuttered. Then the gold died and the king looked away, his jaw set hard enough that she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. "Calder," he said, and his voice was dangerously controlled. "Why is there a seamstress in my study?" Calder, standing by the door with his arms behind his back, didn't flinch. "She's mending the curtain lining, Your Majesty." Tavern's gaze cut to the curtain Otterin had been theoretically assigned to. The curtain that was perfectly intact yesterday. "Moths, Your Majesty." The silence that stretched between the two men could have shattered glass. Aderin held her breath and tried to look extremely absorbed in the perfectly undamaged curtain fabric draped across her lap. "Get out," the king said quietly. "Both of you." They got out. Aderin walked quickly, head down, sewing basket clutched against her body like a shield. She made it to the end of the corridor before Calder caught her arm. "He knows something is happening to him," Calder said, his voice low and urgent. He felt his wolf surface. "He'll start asking questions." "I can't deflect." "Then maybe you should answer them," Aderin said, sharper than she intended. "Instead of sneaking me into rooms under ridiculous pretenses, moths." "Calder?" Something gave way in the beta's composure. "If I tell him the truth before I'm certain, and it turns out I was wrong, the disappointment will finish what the curse started." Aderin stopped walking. "Curse." Calder went very still. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, a calculation, a decision being made. Then he exhaled through his nose and gestured toward an alcove off the main corridor. "Not here." They stepped into the narrow space. Calder leaned against the wall and crossed his arms, and for the first time, Aderin saw the man behind the title, not the king's unshakable right hand. Just a man who was exhausted and frightened and running out of time. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this alcove," he said. "If it does, I will deny every word, and you will lose your position in this palace." "Understood," Audrin said, her mouth going dry. "The king's wolf isn't just dormant," Calder said. "It's dying, actively, deliberately, being killed by a curse placed on him during the Ashfall campaign. The curse severs the bond between the man and the wolf, slowly, like cutting through a rope, one strand at a time." Aderin felt the ground shift beneath her. "That's why he can't shift." "He can't shift, he can't heal at full speed. His senses are dulling, and his body is failing," Calder said, his voice flat with the practiced detachment of a man who had recited these facts to himself too many times. "The palace healers give him 8 months, perhaps less. An alpha without a wolf is a body without a heart. It keeps going for a while on momentum, but it stops. 8 months." The number hit her like a fist. She thought of the way the king's clothes hung loose at his shoulders, the bruised shadows under his eyes, the gray pallor of a man being slowly emptied. "The court doesn't know," Aderin said. "The court suspects." "They don't know the timeline." Calder paused. "Almost no one does." "And you're telling me because you think I can help," Aderin said slowly. "I'm telling you because in 3 days your presence has triggered more wolf responses than every healer and mystic in this kingdom has managed since the campaign." His voice tightened. "I don't know what you are, Miss Otterin. I don't know why his wolf recognizes you when it won't respond to anything else, but I'm not willing to let the king die without finding out." The raw need beneath his composure cut through her defenses. She looked at the beta, really looked at him, and saw the cost of carrying this alone. The same deep shadows under his eyes, the same hollow quality at the edges. More than a year of watching his king, his friend, his alpha dissolve and being powerless to stop it. "What do you need me to do?" Aderin asked quietly. Calder exhaled. It was the sound of a man who'd been holding his breath for a very long time. Tomorrow evening, I'm going to tell him the truth. All of it. What you are, what you do to his wolf, and what I've been doing behind his back for the past 3 days. He paused. And then he's going to want to meet you properly. Properly, Aderin repeated, without the pretense of curtain repairs. I'd appreciate that, Aderin said. The moth excuse was insulting to both of us. The faintest ghost of a smile crossed Calder's face. It vanished immediately. I should warn you. When I tell him what I've done, there will be a reaction. He doesn't tolerate deception, even well-intentioned deception. Especially from me. He's going to be furious, Aderin translated. Furious doesn't begin to cover it, Calder said. But the alternative is watching him die in silence, and I've decided I'd rather have him alive and angry than peaceful and dead. He straightened, smoothed his expression back into the unreadable mask she'd first encountered, and stepped out of the alcove. Be ready tomorrow evening. I'll send for you. Calder, Aderin called after him. He paused. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. He looked at her over his shoulder. I know, he said simply. That doesn't make it easier. He disappeared down the corridor, without looking back. Aderin stood alone in the alcove and tried to steady her breathing. 8 months. The king had 8 months unless something changed. And somehow, impossibly, she was the something. She pressed her hand flat over her own sternum, feeling her heartbeat. Beneath it, deeper, that strange new stirring, faint and restless, and reaching toward the east wing like a thread pulled taut. That night she lay awake in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters. She kept seeing his eyes. The way the gold had surfaced and locked onto hers across the room. The way something behind that gaze had recognized her. Not as a seamstress or a servant or a nobody with dust on her sleeves, as something else entirely. Something that mattered. She pressed her face into the pillow and tried to convince herself that everything was going to be fine. She was not at all convincing. Calder told the king everything. Aderin knew this because she could hear the shouting from 2 corridors away. The walls of the palace were thick, old stone built to withstand siege, and they did absolutely nothing to muffle the sound of King Tavern Morcant's fury. His voice was a roar that echoed through the east wing and sent servants scattering from the hallway like startled birds. Aderin sat on a bench outside the king's study, with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She could make out roughly every third word through the wall. Betrayal. Trust. Behind my back. The word wolf, repeated several times with increasing volume. And Calder's name, spoken like a curse, all on its own. Then silence, somehow worse than the shouting. The door opened. Calder stepped out, his expression immaculate, not a hair out of place. But his left hand was shaking almost imperceptibly at his side. He'll see you now, Calder said. Aderin stared at him. Is he going to kill me? Unlikely, Calder replied. He's already used most of his anger on me. Most? Calder held the door open without further comment. Aderin stood on legs that had forgotten how to work properly and walked inside. The king's study was warm and dim, the heavy curtains pulled, nearly shut against the evening light. Papers lay scattered across his desk in a way that suggested they'd been swept aside by a hand that no longer cared about border disputes. Tavern stood by the window with his back to the room, one arm braced against the frame, his head bowed. He didn't turn when she entered. Your Majesty, Aderin said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. Sit down. His voice was flat, controlled, a control that cost more effort than the shouting had. Aderin sat in the chair. Calder had been positioning for her all week, 10 feet from the desk. She clasped her hands together to keep them from trembling. For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then he turned. The look he gave her was not anger. It was something worse. The raw, exposed expression of a man who had been told that something he'd given up on might still be possible, and who was afraid to believe it. "My beta tells me that my wolf has been responding to your presence," he said. Each word was measured, precise, like he was testing the weight of them before letting them go. "He tells me this has been happening for 3 days, while he conducted experiments behind my back, using you as the variable." "That's accurate," Aderin said. "He also tells me that you agreed to participate voluntarily." "Also accurate. Why?" The question caught her off guard. "Because your beta asked me to help." "You don't know me," Tavern said. "You owe me nothing. You're a seamstress. This has nothing to do with you." Aderin looked at him. At the hollows in his cheeks, the bruised shadows beneath his eyes, the way his hand gripped the window frame like it was the only thing holding him upright. "Calder told me you were dying," she said simply. "I didn't need to know you to care about that." Something moved behind his eyes. He looked away quickly. "This is a practical arrangement," Tavern said, and his voice had gone rough at the edges. "If my wolf truly responds to your proximity, then you'll be reassigned. You'll work here in my study during the day, sewing, mending, whatever Tassara assigns you. I don't care what you do, as long as you're present." "And in exchange?" Aderin asked. "In exchange, you'll be compensated. Better quarters, better pay. Whatever you need." "I don't need better quarters," he frowned. "Everyone needs better quarters. The seamstress's wing is barely habitable. It has a roof and a bed, and nobody yells at me there," Aderin said. "That's a higher standard of living than some places I've been." The faintest flicker crossed his face. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. He studied her for a moment longer, then was comfortable. "Regardless," he said, "you'll be moved." The arrangement began the next morning. Aderin arrived at the king's study with a basket of mending, a pincushion, and a particular dread that came from knowing she was about to spend 8 hours in a confined space with a man who could tear her apart with his bare hands and whose mood could generously be described as volatile. He ignored her. Completely, thoroughly, aggressively ignored her. He worked at his desk with the concentration of a man who had decided that if he didn't acknowledge the seamstress sitting 10 feet away, she would cease to exist through sheer force of will. Aderin sewed. She repaired a torn cloak lining. She reinforced the stitching on a leather belt. She rehemmed a pair of trousers that had been let out too far. She did not speak. The wolf surfaced 4 times before midday. Each time, Tavern's hand would pause on his quill. His breathing would deepen, and the gold would flicker through his eyes like sunlight through storm clouds. Each time, he would clench his jaw and force himself back to his papers without looking at her. By the 3rd day, the silence had become its own presence in the room. A living, breathing weight that pressed against the walls and made Aderin want to scream just to break it. By the 5th day, small things began appearing. A cushion on her chair that hadn't been there the day before. A sewing lamp repositioned to catch the best light from the window. A length of Mauritian lace, expensive and exquisite, left beside her basket without explanation. "Thank you for the lace," Aderin said that evening as she was preparing to leave. Tavern didn't look up from his correspondence. "What lace?" "The Mauritian lace that appeared beside my sewing basket. The kind that costs more than I earn in a month." His ears went faintly red. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Aderin bit her lip to keep from smiling. "Of course, Your Majesty. My mistake." She started humming on the 7th day. Not consciously, just the old melodies Tassara had taught her years ago, work songs and lullabies and aimless tunes that kept hands steady over fine stitching. The first time she hummed, Tavern's quill paused. His wolf surfaced gently, a warm amber glow instead of the usual sharp flare, and held there for nearly 10 minutes. She didn't realize he'd been listening until the next morning when he said, without looking up from his papers, "The song. The one you were humming yesterday. What was it?" "I don't know, actually." Something Tassara used to sing to me when I was small. I don't think it has a name. Would you sing it again? The request was so unexpected, so quiet and almost shy, that something twisted warmly behind Adoran's ribs. She hummed. He worked. His wolf glowed amber behind his eyes, and for 20 minutes the king of Eldrinmere looked almost peaceful. On the 9th day, the healer Nalara recommended physical contact. Brief sessions, clinically supervised. The king listened with the expression of a man being told he needed to swallow something deeply unpleasant for medical reasons. But he agreed. Adoran placed her hand on his forearm. 30 seconds the first time. His wolf surfaced. 60 seconds the next. Stronger. 2 minutes. Stronger still. Each session the gold in his eyes burned brighter, held longer. And each time Adoran felt the answering ache inside her grow more impossible to ignore. The first accidental touch had been something else entirely. She was handing him a repaired document case, and their fingers brushed over the leather binding. Just the barest graze of skin against skin, unplanned and unguarded. His wolf didn't just stir, it surged. Tavern's eyes went full gold. Not a flicker, not a flash, but a complete, sustained blaze that turned his dark irises molten. His hand seized around the document case. A sound escaped him, low and deep and resonant, not a growl, a recognition. Something inside her detonated, and for one dizzying moment, she felt herself reaching towards something inside him across a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. Then Tavern yanked his hand away. The gold died. He stood so abruptly, his chair scraped backward across the stone. "Don't," he said, his voice unsteady. "Don't do that again." But they both knew it was already too late for that. That evening, while Adrian hemmed his sleeve cuff with one hand and rested her fingertips against his wrist with the other, 2 tasks at once, practical and efficient, Tavern told her about the name. "Adrian," he said. "Tassara chose it," she said without looking up from the stitching. "She found me at the palace gates as an infant. No name, no note, nothing. She said I was small and fragile, and looked like I might fly away at any moment." "Did you," he asked, "try to fly away every day?" "For the first 10 years," Adoran said. "Then I stopped running and started stitching and decided that if I couldn't leave, I'd at least make myself useful." She felt his gaze on her face, steady and warm. When she finally looked up, the expression in his amber-lit eyes made her forget how to breathe. "You're more than useful," he said softly. Adoran's face burned. She looked away so fast, she pricked her own finger with the needle. A bead of blood welled on her fingertip. Before she could pull her hand back, Tavern caught it. He held her hand in his, staring at the tiny wound with an intensity that had nothing to do with concern over a needle prick. His thumb brushed across her palm. His wolf blazed gold and steady and sure. "Careful," he murmured, and the word held more weight than it should have. He released her hand. Adoran pressed her bleeding finger against her skirt and tried to remember how breathing worked. Her heart was doing something she couldn't control, and the warmth that flooded her was singing. That night, Adoran fell asleep in her quarters and woke in absolute darkness. Not darkness, something deeper. An absence so total, it had weight pressing against her skin from all sides, suffocating and impossibly cold. There was no sound, no wind, no breath, no heartbeat, nothing. The silence was so complete, it roared in her ears like a living thing. She was in the silence. She knew it the way she knew her own name, with a certainty that bypassed thought entirely. This was where his wolf lived now. Not a place. A cage. A void built to hold and to break. Adoran walked forward, though forward had no meaning here. There were no walls, no floor, no sky. Just the absence of everything, stretching in every direction like the space between stars. Her bare feet made no sound on ground that felt like frozen glass beneath her soles. The cold crept into her bones, first, then her lungs, then the hollows between her ribs, where her breath should have been. The deeper she went, the heavier the silence became. It pressed against her eardrums. It settled on her shoulders like hands pushing her down. The darkness seemed to thicken, congeal, as if it knew she was there and was slowly closing around her. Then she saw it, a wolf, massive and dark-furred, lying on its side in the center of the void. It was enormous, far larger than any wolf she'd ever seen, a creature that legends were built around. But there was nothing legendary about it now. Chains of black iron wrapped around its body, its legs, its throat, biting deep into the fur wherever they touched. The chains didn't come from anywhere. They simply existed, woven into the darkness itself like they had grown from it. As she watched, one of them tightened almost imperceptibly, and the wolf's breathing hitched. Its eyes were open, gold, dim and flickering, guttering like a candle in its last moments. The same gold she saw in Tavern's eyes when her hand was on his skin. It saw her. Its ears shifted forward. A sound escaped its throat, so faint and broken, it might have been a whimper or a word, or both. Aderin dropped to her knees beside it. The cold of the ground seared through her nightgown like ice. She reached for the nearest chain and pulled with everything she had. It didn't move. It was fused to the void itself, immovable, permanent. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the silence almost before it left her lips. "I see you." The wolf's golden gaze found hers, and she felt it crash through her like a wave. The recognition, the ache. The same gravity that lived in her every waking moment, that called to her every time she touched the king, every time she hummed and watched his eyes go amber. His wolf was looking at her with everything it had left, and what it had left was almost nothing. A candle flame in a hurricane, refusing to go out. She pressed her palm flat against the wolf's side. Its fur was cold, so cold, it burned. Beneath it, a heartbeat, faint, unsteady, fighting to continue with a stubbornness that was so painfully, recognizably Tavern, that her eyes filled with tears. The wolf made another sound, stronger this time, and pressed its muzzle against her knee. She felt its breath, shallow and labored, against her skin. She curled her fingers into its fur and held on. "I'm not leaving you," she said. Then she felt it, a presence behind her, not footsteps, because nothing made sound here. A shift in the void itself, the darkness changing quality, becoming denser, colder, aware. Something was approaching through the nothing. With patient, deliberate malice. Something that had been here long before she arrived and intended to be here long after. The wolf's eyes went wide. It lunged against the chains with sudden violent force, trying to rise, trying to get between her and whatever was coming. The chains held bit deeper, and the wolf collapsed with a sound that was half snarl, half sob. Its gold eyes fixed on the darkness over her shoulder, and in them, Aderin saw pure terror. Run. The word appeared in her mind like a brand through bone, not her thought, his. The wolf's last act of protection, spending what little strength it had left to warn her away. The presence drew closer. She could feel it now against the back of her neck, cold and patient and utterly without mercy. A whisper brushed against her ear. Not words, something older than words. A hunger. Aderin woke screaming. She was bolt upright in her bed, soaked in sweat, her hands clawing at the sheet. Her nightgown was damp and freezing against her skin. The ache behind her ribs was a howling, clawing thing. Her wolf thrashing inside her, reaching for something it couldn't find across the distance between her quarters and the east wing. She pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sobs, and tasted salt. For a long time, she sat in the dark with her knees drawn to her body, shaking. The memory of the wolf's eyes wouldn't leave her, the chains tightening. The heartbeat growing fainter, the presence at her back, She didn't sleep again. The summons came before dawn. Not from Calder this time. A guard, stone-faced and formal, standing in the gray corridor, with 4 words. "The king requires you." Her legs carried her to the study on instinct, her body navigating the familiar route, even as her mind replayed the silence. The door was open. Tavern stood behind his desk, and the moment she crossed the threshold, she knew that he knew. His face was ashen beneath the shadows. His hands were flat on the desk, pressing down so hard the wood creaked under the pressure. And his eyes were dark. No gold, no flicker, nothing. The wolf had retreated completely, and what remained was a man staring at her with the expression of someone who just had his worst fear confirmed. "Where did you go last night?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "You know where I went. Say it." "I was in the silence," she said, and her voice trembled despite every effort to steady it. "Your wolf is there, Tavern. It's chained and it's dying, and the chains are getting tighter, and there's something else in there, something that guards it, something that whispered to me." The blood left his face so completely he swayed. His fingers curled against the desk. "It spoke to you." "Not in words," Aderin said, "but it knew I was there, and it wanted me to stay." Tavern closed his eyes. A tremor ran through his shoulders. When he opened them again, something had changed behind those dark irises. Something had shut and locked. "This arrangement is over," he said. "What?" The word came out strangled. "Whatever connection exists between us, whatever allows you to reach my wolf, it also pulls you into the curse. I won't have that. It ends today." Tavern, it was the first time she'd ever used his name without a title. The effect was immediate. He flinched like she'd driven a needle between his ribs. "Your Majesty," he corrected, his voice going sharp and hard enough to cut. "This is not a negotiation. You'll return to the seamstress's wing. You will not come to my study, you will not seek proximity to me, and you will not touch me again. Am I clear?" "You're dying," Aderin said, stepping toward him, refusing to let him retreat behind formality. "Your wolf is dying in chains in the dark, and I've seen it, and I felt its heartbeat against my hand, and you want me to just walk away. I want you safe," he said, and his voice splintered on the last word. He caught it, buried it, but not before she heard the fracture beneath. "I've already cost one person everything because of what I am. I won't cost you too." He stopped himself. His jaw locked shut so violently she heard his teeth grind. "Get out," he said now. Aderin looked at him across the desk and watched the fortress close in real time. Every opening she'd spent weeks, carefully widening. Every moment of warmth and humming and amber eyes and Marithian lace left by her basket, all of it bricking shut behind walls he'd built long before she arrived and had never intended to lower. "Don't do this," she whispered. "Please, get out, Aderin." Her name in his mouth was the cruelest thing she'd ever heard, because it sounded like he was letting go of something he'd only just learned to hold. She turned. She walked to the door. She didn't run, because running would mean she'd accepted it. And she hadn't, not even close. But the door closed behind her with a sound like finality itself, and in the corridor alone, the ache behind her ribs howled like something dying. 5 days without him. 5 days of silence, where there used to be the scratch of his quill and the occasional reluctant huff that she'd learned was his version of a laugh. 5 days without the amber glow in his eyes when she hummed. 5 days without the warmth of his skin, under her fingertips, the steady pulse beneath her palm, the weight of his gaze, when he thought she wasn't looking. Aderin was coming apart, at the seams. The irony would have made her laugh if she could still remember how. Her wolf, that fragile, newly woken thing, that had been growing stronger every day in his presence, went quiet the morning after he sent her away. Not dormant, wounded. It curled tight and small somewhere deep inside her, and refused to stir. The absence of it left a void so vast she couldn't breathe around it. The migraine started on the second day. Blinding, nauseating waves of pain that sent her to her knees in the sewing chamber. Tessara found her crouched beneath the work table with her hands pressed against her temples and her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. "Child," Tessara said, kneeling beside her with the practiced calm of a woman who'd been weathering other people's storms for 40 years. "What's happened?" Aderin couldn't explain. Everything was secret. The arrangement, the king's condition, the curse, the silence. She had nothing she was allowed to say. So she said, "I'm fine. You're under a work table." Tessara said flatly, "I'm fine under a work table." The one that had been cutting through Aderin's nonsense since she was 4 years old and had tried to convince her mentor that the cat had eaten the missing thread. "Don't insult us both, girl. You've been reassigned from the East Wing without explanation. You haven't eaten properly in days, and you look like someone scraped you hollow with a spoon." Aderin's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her lips together and shook her head. Tessara studied her for a long moment. Then, she sat down on the cold stone floor beside Aderin, right there beneath the work table, and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "All right, you don't have to tell me yet." On the 4th day, she caught a glimpse of him across the courtyard. Just a flash. He was walking with Calder, his stride long and purposeful. But wrong somehow, stiff, heavy. The gauntness in his face had deepened visibly in just days, and his movements had the careful quality of a man whose body was forgetting how to carry him. He didn't look at her. She was certain he'd seen her. Certain she'd felt the moment his awareness had touched hers across the distance, a flare of heat that died as quickly as it came. But he kept walking, jaw set, gaze fixed ahead. The magnetic tug in her blood wrenched so hard she dropped the stack of mended uniforms she was carrying. She stood in the courtyard staring after him until a kitchen boy asked if she was all right. On the 5th morning, Aderin collapsed. She was climbing the stairs to the 2nd-floor landing with a bolt of replacement curtain fabric when the world tilted sideways without warning. It wasn't gradual. One moment she was walking, her hands steady on the fabric, her mind occupied with measurements and cutting patterns. The next, the stairwell was spinning, the stone walls blurring into a gray smear, and her legs simply stopped holding her. Her vision went white at the edges. The bolt of fabric tumbled from her arms and unrolled down the stairs in a cascade of dark blue wool. She felt herself pitch forward, felt the sickening, weightless lurch of falling, and then arms caught her. Not his arms, a guard's. He lowered her to the stone floor while shouting for help, his voice echoing off the walls and bouncing back in fragments. She couldn't piece together. Aderin tried to protest that she was fine. She just needed a moment, just needed to sit down. But the words wouldn't form. Her mouth moved and nothing came out. The whiteness at the edges of her vision was spreading, eating the world from the outside in. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her was a voice. Distant, sharp, splitting with something that sounded like terror. Her name, spoken by someone who was running. She woke in the infirmary to the smell of dried herbs and linen, and the sound of someone breathing beside her, in a way that suggested they were trying very hard to keep the breathing even, and failing. Aderin opened her eyes. Tavern was sitting beside her bed. His elbows were on his knees, his head was in his hands, and when he heard her stir, he looked up with an expression that stripped every defense from his face. Relief, terror, guilt, all of it naked, all of it raw. "You're awake," he said, and his voice was hoarse, like he'd been the one screaming. "What happened?" Aderin managed. "You collapsed on the stairwell." He was on his feet, immediately leaning over her, his eyes scanning her face with frantic intensity. "The guard said you weren't breathing for almost a full minute. Nalara had to." He stopped, swallowed. "You weren't breathing, Aderin?" I'm breathing now, she offered weakly. That's not funny. His voice buckled in a way that made her throat ache. Behind him, Nalara stood with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral. Tessara was beside the door, watching the king with sharp, knowing eyes. Nalara won't tell me what's wrong with you, Tavern said, turning to glare at the healer. Something about patient confidentiality. It is patient confidentiality, Nalara confirmed without flinching. Tavern's growl was low and raw and wild. I need to know what's wrong with my... He stopped himself. His jaw locked on the word. He wouldn't let himself say. The silence that followed was deafening. With the seamstress, he finished, and the substitution was so transparent that Tessara actually rolled her eyes behind his back. Aderin made a decision. She was tired of secrets, tired of walls, tired of watching him destroy himself behind carefully constructed defenses while she fell apart on the other side. I'll tell you what's wrong with me, she said, pushing herself upright, despite Nalara's protesting hand. But only if you tell me what's wrong with you first. The real answer, not the version Calder gave me. Tavern stared at her. You're in no position to negotiate. I just stopped breathing for a minute on a stairwell, Aderin said. I'm in the perfect position to negotiate, because apparently I might die, and I'd like to know why before I do. Something in his face broke, a hairline fracture that spread across his composure and let everything behind it bleed through. Nalara stepped forward, with the precision of a woman who recognized an opening. Your Majesty, she said gently. She entered the silence. She's seen the wolf. She's earned the truth. And frankly, keeping it from the people trying to save you is what's killing you both. Tavern sank back into the chair beside the bed. His shoulders dropped. The fight went out of him in a way that was almost more frightening than the fury. My brother, he said. The room went still. Solon, he was 3 years younger than me. Brilliant tactician. Reckless. Stubborn. Laughed too loud. Never lost a sparring match unless he let you win. His hands curled into fists on his knees. His voice was flat, reciting facts, but his knuckles were bone white. During the Ashval campaign, something happened. The battle at Varenmouth. His wolf couldn't take it. The carnage, the loss, something broke. A feral shift. His wolf consumed him entirely, and Solan with it. He began killing indiscriminately. His own soldiers, civilians, anyone in reach. He couldn't tell friend from enemy anymore. There was nothing behind his eyes. Aderin's breath caught. I tried to reach him, tried everything. Called his name until my voice gave out. Tried to pin him, restrain him. Nothing worked. The wolf had swallowed everything that was Solon and left only the killing. A pause that stretched like a wound. So, I put him down, my own brother. I held him while he shifted back, and I watched the madness drain from his eyes, and the last thing he said to me was my name. Just my name. Like he was surprised to see me there. Aderin's vision blurred with tears. She could feel his grief through the bond, even incomplete as it was. A crushing, airless weight that had been sitting on him since the campaign. Solon's mate was a seer named Vela, Tavern continued, his voice barely audible now. She was there. She watched me kill the man she loved, while she screamed his name, and before she fled into the mountains, she cursed me. His eyes closed. Your wolf will die the way mine died, slowly, screaming, in the dark. The words hung in the air like smoke. That's the silence, Aderin whispered. That's what I saw. Your wolf, chained in the dark. It's been dying ever since, Tavern said. Every day. The chains tighten. Every day. There's less of it left. And I can't reach it. I can hear it sometimes, faintly, like a voice at the bottom of a well, but I can't get to it. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and his expression was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen. You reached it. You touched it. And for a moment, just a moment, the chains loosened. Then, let me help, Aderin said fiercely. No, the word was immediate, reflexive. The thing in the silence, The presence you felt behind you, that's the curse itself. It guards the wolf. It feeds on my guilt, and it's growing stronger, because he faltered. Because you believe you deserve it, Adarin finished. Tavern recoiled as if she'd slapped him. He stood, putting distance between them, his expression shuddering closed. This conversation is over, he said. Nalara will see to your recovery. You'll stay in the infirmary until you're well, and then you'll return to your quarters. Tavern, please. It's an order. He left without looking back. The moment his footsteps faded, Tessara closed the infirmary door firmly and turned to Adarin. You share a bond, Tessara said, her voice quiet and certain. A mate bond. Incomplete, but it's there. It's been there since the ball. I know, Adarin whispered, surprising herself with how steady the words came out. Then you also know that if his wolf dies, he dies, Nalara said from across the room. And the collapse of an incomplete mate bond is not something a body survives. His death will be yours. Adarin stared at the ceiling. Her wolf stirred faintly, painfully, reaching for something it couldn't find. Then go through the people he trusts, Tessara said. Calder. Adarin looked at her mentor. The old seamstress had the sharpest eyes of anyone she'd ever known, and right now they were fierce and bright and proud. You've spent your whole life making yourself small, Tessara said. Invisible, useful, but never important. You were left at the gates with nothing, and you decided that meant you deserved nothing. Her voice softened. But this man's wolf chose you, Adarin. His wolf chose you before either of you knew what was happening. That means something. Adarin felt the tears spill over. She didn't wipe them away. He'll fight you, Tessara warned. I know, Adarin said. I don't care. Tessara smiled, small and fierce and proud. The smile of a woman who had raised a foundling from infancy and was watching her stand up for the first time. Nalara, Tessara said. Get word to Calder. Already done, Nalara replied, and something in her voice suggested she'd sent the message before Adarin had even woken up. He's been waiting for her to decide. Calder met her at the entrance to the east wing just after nightfall. The palace was quiet, the corridors empty, the torches burning low in their sconces. He's in the training yards, Calder said. He goes there every night now. Fights the practice dummies until his hands bleed, because he can't sleep, and he can't shift, and he has nowhere to put the fury. Adarin's throat tightened. How long before he comes back to his chambers? An hour. Maybe less. He's been slower this week. Calder paused, and the weight of those words hung between them. Slower meant weaker. Weaker meant the wolf was fading faster than even Nalara had predicted. The guard at Tavern's door stepped aside without a word at Calder's nod. The beta opened the door for her, and Adarin stepped inside. The king's chambers were larger than she'd imagined. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, heavy curtains drawn against the night, weapons on the walls, a desk covered in papers, and in the center of the room, impossible to ignore, the bed. It was enormous, built for a man who was himself enormous, and the sight of it made something low in Adarin's stomach tighten. She could smell him everywhere. His scent saturated the room, soaked into the wood and the fabric and the air itself. It wrapped around her and made her wolf stir painfully, reaching for the source of the scent that meant safety and warmth and home. I'll be nearby, Calder said from the doorway. If he orders the guards to remove you, I'll intervene. But Adarin, she turned. His expression was grave. I can get you through the door. The rest is yours. Then his footsteps retreated down the corridor, and she was alone in the king's rooms with her racing pulse, and a conviction she refused to let waver. She moved to the window seat and sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. When Tavern opened the door 40 minutes later, he stopped so abruptly. The door nearly swung back into him. He stood in the frame, silhouetted against the torchlit corridor, and stared at her like he was seeing something impossible. Adarin. Her name was Disbelief Made Sound. She rose to her feet, her heart hammering. Before you call the guards, hear me out. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. His hands were at his sides, tight and bloodied from the practice dummies. She could see the fine tremor running through his shoulders. The way his lungs moved with each breath, like even breathing, had become a conscious effort. The exhaustion in his face was staggering. He looked like a man whose body was standing only through sheer refusal to fall. "You can't be here," he said, his voice rough. "I can't be anywhere else," she replied, holding his gaze. "Separation is killing me, Tavern. Not slowly, not gradually. I collapsed on a stairwell. I stopped breathing for nearly a minute. Nalara says the incomplete bond is tearing me apart, the same way the curse is tearing you apart. And staying away isn't protecting me, it's destroying us both." Something flickered behind his eyes. Fear, guilt. An aching longing he couldn't hide, no matter how hard he tried. "There is no bond," he said, but his voice had no conviction in it. "None at all. You know that's not true." Adarin stepped toward him. He stiffened, but didn't retreat. "Your wolf chose me." Before either of us understood what was happening, before the ball, before the study, before any of it, your wolf looked at me and decided, and my wolf, the one that's been dormant my entire life, woke up and answered. Tavern's jaw worked, which is exactly why you should be as far from me as possible. The bond makes you vulnerable to the curse. If the silence takes me, it will take you too. It's already taking me, Adarin said, moving closer. Every day we're apart, it takes a little more. The bond doesn't care about distance or orders or noble intentions. It just pulls, and eventually there won't be enough of either of us left to save. She was close enough now to see the rapid pulse at his throat, close enough to see the way his pupils had dilated, the way his breathing had gone shallow. Close enough to feel the heat of his body and the magnetic force between them, so strong it made her vision swim. "So you knew," she said softly, "about the bond. You knew this whole time." He closed his eyes. The sound he made was barely human. "How could I not know? Your scent is in every room I walk through. I smell you in the corridors, in the training yards, on my own skin even after I've bathed. I wake up reaching for you, and you're not there, and the absence is so total it feels like a wound that won't close." He opened his eyes. They were dark and raw and utterly exposed. "I can't think, I can't focus, I can't breathe properly. My wolf screams for you every waking moment, and when it falls silent, the silence is even worse because it means it's dying." His voice splintered, rough and ragged. "And I know that letting you close will put you in danger, and I know that keeping you away is killing you, and I have no idea which choice destroys us less. I have been standing between those two options and neither one lets me keep you safe." "Then stop trying to choose for me," Adarin said. "Let me decide what I'm willing to risk." "You don't understand what you'd be risking." "I understand exactly what I'd be risking," she said, and her voice was steady now. Steadier than it had any right to be. "I'd be risking the silence, the curse, whatever lives in that darkness that guards your wolf, and I'm choosing it anyway. Because the alternative is watching you die from a distance, and I won't do that. I can't." Tavern stared at her. His defenses were crumbling. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped, the way his fists unclenched, the way his breathing shuddered. Adarin kissed him. She rose up on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, her hands, coming up to cradle his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. She poured everything into it. Every aching day of separation, every sleepless night, every moment she'd spent pressing her hand to her sternum and feeling the tug. He didn't respond for one heartbeat. 2, 3. Then something inside him gave way. His arms came around her, crushing her against him. His mouth opened against hers, urgent and shaking and starving. He kissed her like he was drowning and she was air. Like he'd been holding himself together with bare hands for over a year, and the effort had finally exceeded what he had left. "We shouldn't," he said against her lips, even as his hands tangled in her hair. "Tell me to stop," she whispered back. He didn't tell her to stop. Instead, he lifted her, just gathered her up in his arms like she weighed nothing at all, and carried her across the room, without breaking the kiss. He laid her down on the bed and settled beside her, and the warmth of him was everywhere surrounding her, soaking into her skin, until the cold of the last 5 days felt like a distant memory. Adoran's fingers found the collar of his shirt, and he helped her ease it from his shoulders. She pressed her palm flat against his heart and felt it hammering beneath her hand, strong and fast and alive. He covered her hand with his, held it there, and kissed her again, with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. What followed was overwhelming, new and achingly gentle, and fierce all at once. The world narrowed to warmth and closeness and the impossible rightness of being exactly where she was meant to be. Every wall between them came down, and what remained was just them, bare and honest and whole. When Adoran whispered his name, it sounded like a vow, and then, driven by something older than thought, he pressed his mouth to her neck and bit down. The mating bite. The bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock. Audryn felt it blaze through her, golden and fierce and right, connecting her to him at a depth that went past flesh, past thought, past anything she had words for. She bit him back, marking his shoulder, claiming him as hers, and felt his wolf surge to life between them, a roar of gold that blazed through the bond, so bright she saw it behind her closed eyelids. For one glorious, impossible moment, the wolf was free, unchained, whole. Then the moment passed, and the gold dimmed, and the chains she couldn't see began to tighten again. But it had been there. The wolf had been there, fully alive, fully present, and the memory of it burned in both of them like a promise. They lay tangled together afterward, his arms around her, her head on his body. His heartbeat was slow and steady beneath her ear. His fingers traced absent patterns on her shoulder, and his breathing was deeper than she'd ever heard it. Peaceful. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her hair, "for sending you away. For all of it." "Don't apologize," Adoran whispered. "Just don't do it again." He huffed a sound that was almost a laugh. His arms tightened around her, and she felt him surrender to sleep the way a man steps off a cliff. Complete and total freefall. His body went heavy and warm beneath her, and his breathing evened out into something trusting and unguarded. Joy swelled through her, bright and fragile and fierce. She closed her eyes. Sleep pulled her under. She woke in absolute darkness. The silence was different this time. The darkness was the same, absolute and suffocating, pressing against her skin like frozen hands. The cold was the same, biting deep into her bones, her lungs, the hollows where breath should have been. But Adoran could feel the bond now, a golden thread running through the void, humming with warmth, connecting her to Tavern even here where nothing else existed. She followed it. The thread led her through the formless dark, like a lifeline through deep water. She moved without seeing, guided by the warmth that meant him. And as she walked, the darkness began to change. It thickened, congealed, took on a presence and a weight that whispered at the edges of her hearing. The curse knew she was there, and this time it was ready. She found him on his knees. Not standing, not fighting. On his knees in the center of the void, his head bowed, his hands flat against the frozen ground. The wolf lay beside him, chained and gasping, its gold eyes dim. The chains were tighter than before, biting deeper into the dark fur, and with every labored breath the wolf took, Adoran could see another link constrict. "Tavrin!" she called, rushing forward. Her bare feet were silent on the frozen ground. She dropped beside him and reached for his face. Look at me. He didn't respond. His eyes were fixed ahead, staring at something beyond her. She followed his gaze, and her blood went cold. A figure stood at the edge of the void. A young man, tall and lean with Tavern's jaw and Tavern's dark hair, but younger, softer. He wore a soldier's uniform torn and stained dark. His eyes were clear, lucid, confused, sullen. Not the feral wolf who had killed without recognition, the boy beneath, the brother, looking at Tavern with an expression of gentle bewilderment, as if he'd just woken from a terrible dream and couldn't understand why his brother was on his knees. "Why didn't you save me?" Solon asked. His voice was quiet, patient, almost kind, which made it infinitely worse. Through the bond, Adrin felt Tavern's guilt hit like a wall of black water. It was staggering, enormous. The accumulated weight of more than a year of grief and self-punishment compressed into a single frequency. It nearly knocked her flat. "I tried," Tavern whispered. "I tried everything." "You didn't try hard enough," the ghost said. And Adoran could hear it now. These weren't Solon's words. This was Tavern's guilt wearing his brother's face, speaking with his brother's voice, telling him every night what he already believed. "A better brother would have found another way," the ghost continued. "A better Alpha would have been stronger. You could have restrained me. You could have waited. You chose the easy path, and now I'm here forever." "I know," Tavern said. "I know." He agreed with it. Adoran felt the agreement through the bond, clear and gutting. He wasn't fighting the silence. He was surrendering to it, the same way he had been surrendering to it every night since Ashfall. Paying a debt he believed he owed with the only currency the curse would accept. His wolf, his life. The chains tightened. The wolf whimpered. "Stop," Adoran said, gripping Tavern's arm. "Stop agreeing with it. This isn't Solon. This is the curse. And it's using your grief as a weapon." "It doesn't matter," Tavern said, his voice hollow. "The words are still true." "They're not true," Adoran said fiercely. "You didn't choose the easy path." "There was no easy path. Your brother was gone, Tavern. The feral shift had taken him. He was killing his own people. You didn't murder Solan. You ended his suffering when no one else had the courage to do it. I should have found another way." "There was no other way." Tears burned her eyes. "And you know that. Somewhere, beneath all this guilt, you know it. Because if there had been another way, you would have found it. You would have torn the world apart to find it. But it didn't exist." The ghost of Solon tilted its head, watching her. The curse assessing a new variable. "You can't fix this," it said, turning its attention to her. Its voice shifted, became something colder, more ancient. "His guilt is the chain. His belief is the lock. As long as he agrees with me, the wolf dies." The presence closed around her, pressing in from all sides. The whisper returned, brushing against the back of her neck with patient hunger. She felt the cold deepen, felt the void tighten, and for the first time since entering the silence, she was truly afraid. But she had been afraid before. She had been afraid her entire life. Afraid of being too visible, too loud, too much. Afraid that the parents who left her at the gates had been right to leave. Afraid that she didn't deserve to take up space, to be seen, to matter, and she had survived every single time. Not by being brave, by refusing to disappear. Adoran turned back to Tavern and took his face in her hands. His skin was ice cold, his eyes unfocused, lost in the guilt that had been eating him alive since Ashfall. She forced him to look at her. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, her voice thick with tears. "And you're going to listen. Because your wolf is dying and you're dying, and I just found you, and I refuse to lose you to a ghost that isn't even real." His eyes focused on hers, barely, but enough. "I was left at the palace gates when I was 3 days old," Audrin said, "in a flour sack. No name, no note, no explanation. Just a baby in a sack on a cold stone step. And for 23 years, I believed I deserved it. That I was left because something was wrong with me. That if I'd been different, better, quieter, smaller, someone would have kept me. Tavern's eyes sharpened. Through the bond, she felt his attention lock onto her, his grief interrupted by something else. Concern for her. I spent my whole life trying to earn the right to exist, she continued, tears running freely down her face. Stitching and mending and making myself useful, because I thought that was the only way I was allowed to take up space. And I know you understand that because you've been doing the same thing. Except your version is standing still while a curse tears you apart and telling yourself you've earned it. She pressed her forehead against his. But you haven't earned it, Tavern. Losing Solon was the worst thing that ever happened to you, and it will never stop hurting. I know that. Some tears don't mend invisibly. You can stitch them closed, you can reinforce the seams, but the line will always be there, and that's all right. The garment doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to hold. She felt him trembling under her hands, felt the walls that had held since Ashfall beginning to give way. You're allowed to carry the grief, she whispered. You're allowed to miss him every day for the rest of your life, but you are not allowed to die for it. Not when your wolf is fighting to survive in chains. Not when there are people out there who need their king. Not when I just found you. Her voice broke on the last words. She gripped his face tighter. Let him go, Tavern. Let Solon rest. You can love your brother and still choose to live. Those two things are allowed to exist at the same time. For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The void pressed in. The curse whispered. The chains held. Then Tavern's hands came up and covered hers. I'm sorry, he said to the ghost. His voice was raw, wrecked, rebuilt from pieces. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry there was no other way. I'm sorry I've been keeping you here because I couldn't bear to let you go. The ghost of Solan looked at his brother, and for the first time, the expression on its face wasn't accusation. It was recognition, real recognition. The kind that had nothing to do with curses and everything to do with a younger brother who finally understood. Solon smiled. It was small, sad, and so gentle it broke Adarin's heart. Then he was gone, dissolved into the dark like smoke on a cold morning. The chains shattered. The sound was enormous, iron and ice, and grief splintering apart in an eruption that echoed through the void like a thunderclap. The wolf surged to its feet, massive and powerful and alive, its gold eyes blazing with a fury and a joy that made the darkness tremble. It threw its head back and howled. The sound split the silence wide open. Cracks of golden light raced through the void like lightning through stone, and the darkness began to peel apart, shredding away in strips, until there was nothing left but warmth and light, and the steady thrum of a heartbeat. 2 heartbeats, beating in perfect, synchronized rhythm. Adarin woke in Tavern's arms. Dawn light was filtering through the curtains, pale and gold. She was pressed against him, his arms wrapped around her, his face buried in her hair. She could feel his heartbeat, strong and even and sure. And beneath it, deeper, something else. A presence, vast and warm and golden, humming through the bond with a vitality that hadn't been there before. His wolf, alive, awake, free. His arms tightened around her, and when she looked up, his eyes were open. They were gold. Not flickering, not flashing, not guttering like a dying flame. Steady, warm, permanent gold. He cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed the tears from her cheeks that she hadn't realized were there. Thank you, he whispered. The word held everything. Over a year of darkness, of chains, of a wolf screaming in a void, all of it broken open by a foundling seamstress with dust on her sleeves and a heart fierce enough to walk into the dark and refuse to leave. Adirin smiled through her tears and pressed her face against him and held on. The bond hummed between them like a song. The wolf didn't return all at once. There were still nights when Tavern woke in the dark, his breathing sharp, his hands reaching for chains that were no longer there. The grief didn't vanish. It never would. Solon's name still caught in his throat sometimes. And there were mornings when Aderin found him staring out the window at the mountains where the Ashfall campaign had been fought, his expression distant and heavy with memory. But Aderin was there. Every night, every morning. She held him when the grief surged. She hummed the old melodies when the quiet pressed too close. And slowly, painfully slowly, his wolf grew stronger. The first time he shifted, she was beside him. They were standing in the private courtyard behind the royal chambers, the autumn air crisp and cold, and she saw the change begin in his eyes. The gold blazed bright, his body tensed, and then he was gone, and in his place stood a wolf, so large and so beautiful it stole the breath from her lungs, dark-furred, golden-eyed, radiating a presence that made the ground feel like it was humming. He pressed his massive head against her stomach, and she buried her hands in his fur and wept. Their mating was officially announced a week later. A foundling seamstress as the Alpha King's mate was not what anyone had envisioned. The whispers followed Aderin through every corridor, every hall, every formal dinner, where she sat in borrowed gowns and felt the weight of 500 stairs. But Tavrin's hand was always steady in hers. His voice was always sure when he introduced her, and when the whispers grew loud enough to sting, he leaned close and murmured against her temple, "They'll adjust. And if they don't, they can take it up with their king, who happens to be entirely, irrevocably, and somewhat embarrassingly devoted to his mate." Embarrassingly, Aderin raised an eyebrow. Calder's word, not mine, though he's not wrong. On their wedding day, Aderin stood before the court in a gown she had sewn herself. Every stitch was perfect. The fabric was Mauritian lace, the same lace he had left beside her basket all those weeks ago and denied with red-tipped ears. Tessara sat in the front row and cried so hard Nalara had to pass her a handkerchief 3 times. Now, months later, Aderin woke slowly to pale morning light filtering through the curtains. Tavern was still asleep beside her, his face peaceful, his breathing deep and unhurried. One arm was wrapped around her waist, holding her close even in sleep. His wolf hummed through the bond, steady and warm and whole. No chains. No darkness. No silence waiting to drag him under. Aderin watched him for a moment, warmth flooding through her, so full she thought it might overflow. Then she settled back against his shoulder, let her eyes drift closed, and they slept.